Shocking, the $100 billion propeller leak that blinded the Navy. The sonar room is full of nothing. A Lowe's Angels-class boat rides a thermal like it always does, waiting for the Soviet sub that used to rumble like a tractor. The contact slips under the layer and vanishes. We lost the ocean overnight. Not a spy swap, not a stolen blueprint, an export form, a machine code. Off a $17 million civilian sale, the Navy's acoustic libraries turn useless. Wasted arrays, broken war plans, years of training, gone. One Norwegian software box and a Japanese MBP 110 9-axis mill teach Soviet propellers to whisper. Rewind. Who sold what, to whom, and why nobody stopped it in the 1980s? Here's the question that kept skippers awake. How did a civilian milling machine erase America's edge under the waves? For 3 decades, the United States built an undersea advantage on sound. SOS-US lines stretched across choke points, towed arrays rode behind surface ships and subs, and analysts memorized a library of Soviet signatures down to the blade count and shaft wobble. It worked because the ocean rewarded predictability. The Soviets were loud. We could hear them coming. Now raise the stakes. Carrier groups depend on early cues to keep missiles and torpedoes at arm's length. Ballistic missile subs, the ultimate backstop, survive by staying unfound. NATO choke points, the GIUK gap, the Kuril exits, the straits, are only manageable when you know what's moving through them. In the late 1980s, that certainty cracked. Washington would spend tens of billions chasing the silence. Some estimates ran to $100 billion because of a $17 million export that looked harmless on paper. Meet the players. In Japan, Toshiba Machine built heavy iron that could carve metal with frightening precision. In Norway, Kongsberg Vapenfabrik wrote control software for guidance and high-end CNC systems. In Leningrad's Baltic shipyard and other Soviet yards, engineers had the math for quiet propellers, but not the tools to cut them. In the Pentagon, the US Navy rode its acoustic advantage hard. And in grey offices across Allied capitals sat COCOM gatekeepers, tasked with stopping sensitive tech from crossing the line. Now the roadmap. Start with the hardware and code. Toshiba's MBP 110, towering 2-story 9-axis capable milling centers, paired with Kongsberg's simultaneous multi-axis interpolation algorithms. That combination turns raw bronze into perfectly skewed, smooth propellers with sub-millimeter tolerances. Then watch the ocean change. Akula patrols start presenting signatures that don't fit the book. Towed arrays catch less. SOS-US lines queue less often. Analysts begin to miss what they were trained to expect. We'll build it step by step. First, the sound America trusted, how blade count, pitch, and machining tolerances create tonal lines and broadband noise, and why the old Soviet props were predictable. Then, the Soviet wall. Design bureaus that could sketch silence but couldn't mill it, stuck with 5-axis limits and hand finishing that left chatter marks you could hear across an ocean. Meanwhile, procurement takes a side door. On paper, the machines are for civilian marine components, improving electric power utilities. Parts ship separately. Paperwork blurs specifics. The approvals inch forward. Back at sea, crews start logging, ghosting. Contacts fade beneath thresholds that used to be reliable. A watchstander writes up a non-event that should have been a raw. Is it oceanography, deception, or something physical, cut into metal? The turning point comes when multiple patrol areas report the same nothing. Analysts align timelines and notice an ugly correlation. The quietest boats are coming out of yards that just got new capability. Akula signatures show a step change. Rear Admiral Thomas Brooks would later frame it as a shock. Open source and Navy commentary pointed to dramatic improvements, while 20-fold became a shorthand for the scale of change. The safe ground is this. Delaying cavitation and scrubbing tonals produced reductions large enough to blind long-trusted sensors. Then the unraveling. Humint whispers from shipyards, serial numbers that trace to control units, maintenance logs hinting at unfamiliar update cycles. Analysts spot prop geometries you don't get without simultaneous multi-axis interpolation. The trail runs through Kongsberg's code and Toshiba's MBP 110 platforms. Politically, it explodes in 1987. Hearings, sanctions threats, and that unforgettable image. US lawmakers smashing Toshiba radios with sledgehammers on the Capitol steps. Tokyo and Oslo scramble. Internal probes, export ministry damage control, carefully worded statements. Executives speak of errors in documentation, careful to dodge the word submarine. Publicly, the narrative is simple betrayal. Classified rooms carry the harder truth. Speeches don't restore sonar. From there, the long tail. Budgets surge into new arrays, low-frequency upgrades and processing overhauls. Doctrine shifts, patrol boxes expand. Aviation flies harder to fill gaps. Non-acoustic bets get money. The lesson seeps into export law through the 199s and 200s. Control software matters as much as steel. And in the background, other navies take notes. The metadata of capability, tolerances, calibration files, algorithm features, turns into strategy. This is where Toshiba's MBP 110 iron and Kongsberg's interpolation software become more than parts. They become a playbook. That's our route. The sound we trusted, the wall they hit, the machine and code that bridged it, the day the library went quiet, the scramble, the firestorm, and the bill. Now, hear the sound America thought would never change. The sound that won the Cold War. To understand the loss, you have to hear the ocean the way the Navy did for 3 decades. Sound wasn't noise, it was identity. Across the Atlantic and Pacific, the United States laid ears on the seafloor. SOSUS arrays built from Bell Labs math and Cold War urgency, listening for long, low frequencies that could travel hundreds of miles. Towed arrays hung behind frigates, destroyers and subs, thin lines of hydrophones that turned moving water into moving data. Back on shore, analysts built a library, class by class, yard by yard, boat by boat. Here's how that library worked. A propeller isn't just a spinning fan, it's a fingerprint. Blade count sets the main beat. Pitch distribution, the angle along each blade, colors the harmonics. Machining tolerances, the tiny deviations from the design, add wobble. Shaft misalignment produces a steady telltale line. Rough surfaces create broadband hiss. Past a certain speed, cavitation kicks in, microbubbles forming and collapsing at blade tips, like popping bubble wrap underwater, loud and distinct. Stack those together, and you get a signature. Strong tonals at predictable frequencies, a forest of overtones, and a background of flow and machinery noise. For a long time, the Soviets were generous with clues. They could design quiet blades on paper, but the metal told another story. Castings had flaws. Hand finishing introduced ripples you could hear. Tool chatter from imperfect machines etched repeating patterns into bronze. Their quality control lagged. You saw it in consistent errors. A blade slightly thicker near the root, a hub blade transition with a hard edge, a tip left too sharp. On a spectrogram, those choices glowed. Crews joked about roaring tractors, but the truth was colder. Predictability bred confidence. A Victor or a Yankee came with a chorus you could count on. Talk to a sub-hunter from the early 198s, and you'll hear the human side of that math. He'll tell you he could ride a thermal layer, adjust speed to keep flow noise down, and sit with the waterfall display, waiting for the blade rate to present. He'd count peaks, 5-7 blade rhythm, check for shaft wobble, look for gearbox lines. Then he'd call it. Class, likely yard, sometimes even which series. He knew the Sierra hum from the Delta thrum, not because of mystique, but because the library had been built one detection at a time, checked against patrol patterns and satellite tasking. Why was the US so far ahead? Investment, yes, but also feedback. American boats chased Soviet boats and recorded them. SOSUS cued P-3 Orions to drop sonobuoys in the right water. Surface ships pushed their towed arrays into convergences where sound bent back towards sensors. Each successful trail added another note to the archive. Engineers tweaked signal processing, better beamforming, more effective narrowband detectors, so faint lines stood out. The system tightened, and the culture tightened with it. Young watchstanders were trained to trust ears refined by math. Now the physics that made that confidence possible. If your blade geometry is rough, if the pitch distribution isn't consistent across the radius, if the skew is off, You get pressure fluctuations that show up as low-frequency tonals. If your surface finish is poor, microturbulence blooms into broadband noise. If your hub blade transition has a sharp discontinuity, vortices shed at a steady rate. Another line in the book. And when your machine tools can't hold tolerance across complex, twisted surfaces, each blade ends up a little different. That mismatch means the propeller sings in chords instead of a pure note. Great for tracking, bad for stealth. This is the seed that matters later. Tighten those variables by fractions of a millimeter across the entire blade, and you push cavitation onset higher, smooth out pressure pulses, and erase the easy tells. But back then, in the early 198s, US analysts assumed the Soviets couldn't achieve that at scale. Their 5-axis machines weren't truly simultaneous across all required motions for steeply skewed naval props. They needed interpolation that could synchronize multiple axes without lag, keep tool pressure even, and maintain rigidity over huge, heavy castings. Without that, finishing was artisanal and acoustically messy. Meanwhile, the library grew complacent in a subtle way. It wasn't arrogance, it was statistics. When you've logged thousands of hours of consistent signatures, your brain learns to discount outliers. A stray, cleaner-than-expected pass gets chalked up to ocean conditions, a lucky angle, a peculiar layer. The system was built to confirm what it already knew. The Soviets were behind in manufacturing precision, and sonic truth favored the West. Even warnings from a few analysts, citing Soviet research papers on cavitation and skew, were filed under eventually, but not now. Meanwhile, the Akula program was maturing, positioned to cash in on any manufacturing leap the minute it appeared. And then the first oddities. A contact that seemed light on tonals slips through a choke point with only a hint of blade rate. A towed array track that should have produced a forest gives you a few skinny trees. The watchstander flags it, but there's no pattern yet. Another crew months later reports a similar feel, cleaner prop, less broadband wash, again dismissed as environmental. The ocean is fickle. You never overreact to a single pass. Here, that's where the assumption cracked. The math always said machining tolerances drove acoustic reality. The United States built an empire of listening on that principle, but the belief that the other side couldn't close the gap with better tools, right now, without fanfare, was the blind spot. The ocean didn't care who had the patent. It only cared about smooth pressure gradients and tight geometry. When the tools finally arrived where they weren't supposed to, the sound America trusted became a vanishing act. The library wasn't wrong. It was dated, and the ocean doesn't forgive stale knowledge. The Soviet requirement and the wall they hit. To grasp why the ocean went quiet, go inside the Soviet design bureaus in the early 1980s. Their theorists weren't guessing. They had the equations for cavitation onset, the pressure distributions for skewed blades, and wind tunnel-style water tunnels to test scale models. They could draw silence. What they couldn't do was cut it into metal with the accuracy those drawings demanded, at least not for the largest naval propellers, and not repeatably. Here's their pain point. Domestic machine tools handled 5 axes, but 5-axis on paper didn't mean true simultaneous, high-fidelity interpolation under heavy loads. For a deeply skewed, high aspect ratio submarine prop, every tiny pause, every tool deflection, every interpolation lag becomes a pressure ripple you can hear. The big Soviet mills lacked hyperrigid frames and the control loops to keep multiple axes perfectly synchronized across complex surfaces. The result was subtle, but on Sonar it was brutal. Edges where there should have been blends, micro-steps where there should have been sweeps, a hub blade transition that shed vortices in neat, trackable rhythms. They tried workarounds. Casting closer to final shape saved roughing time, but casting still carried internal stresses and surface irregularities that finishing couldn't fully erase. Hand polishing helped gloss the metal, but a human arm can't enforce a mathematically smooth curvature over 10 meters of bronze. You get islands of perfection surrounded by seas of almost right, and almost right is loud. Tool chatter from imperfect rigidity left faint, repeating tooth marks that turned into harmonics. Cross your fingers and you might push cavitation a few knots higher. Miss by fractions of a millimeter, and you gift your adversary a clean, countable blade rate. There was pressure from the fleet, too. Yankee and Delta boats carried the crown jewels, but they were noisy enough that US trackers felt confident. Soviet admirals knew quiet was life. They wanted typhoons that could slip under ice without broadcasting. They wanted attack boats that could stalk, not just sprint. The design bureaus had a simple equation written on their walls. Silence equals geometry times surface finish, divided by tolerance error. The math said the frontier wasn't a new ally or a different number of blades. It was cutting the shape they already understood with tighter control than the Soviet tool base could deliver. That's why their eyes wandered west, not for a drawing. For a capability, Toshiba's MBP-110 mass and Kongsberg's control brain bundled as civilian modernization. They needed two things they couldn't build at scale in the early 198s: a hyperrigid, large-format milling center that could hold geometry across enormous propeller blanks, and a control brain that could drive truly simultaneous multi-axis motion without hiccups. The missing piece was algorithmic, the ability to interpolate in real time across multiple axes so the cutter never paused in a way that gouged pressure fields. A slow servo loop here, a rounding error there, and your elegant pressure gradient turns into a chorus. Meanwhile, the shipyards kept missing the acoustic targets the design bureau set. Inspectors might sign off on dimensions with calipers and templates, but Sonar doesn't care about averages. It hears the outliers. One blade tips slightly off thickness, a fillet radius off by a hair, and the propeller hums a note the US library already knew by heart. Engineers tried to randomize tiny variations to smear the tonals, but that demanded even better control. To randomize well, you first have to be precise. So procurement took a side door. Instead of a military contract that would trigger red lights, the ask shifted to civilian capability. Machine tools for marine components, ostensibly to improve output at major yards. The target wasn't mysterious to insiders. In Japan, Toshiba Machine built the MBP-110, towering two-story mills with the mass and stiffness to hold accuracy over huge parts. In Norway, Kongsberg Vapenfabric wrote the kind of control software that made missiles obey, simultaneous multi-axis interpolation that could choreograph complex motion like a conductor with perfect timing. On paper, those two worlds didn't have to meet. In practice, Toshiba's MBP-110 and Kongsberg's simultaneous multi-axis interpolation fit like a key in a lock. The MBP-110 gave the cutting head a platform that wouldn't flex and drift under the weight of a prop blank. Kongsberg's code told that head exactly how to move. No dwell marks at curvature transitions. No cumulative error stacking at the blade tip. No lag that turned a smooth helical sweep into a faint staircase. That combination meant a yard could finally turn a drawing that used to be aspirational into a surface the ocean would forgive. But getting it past the gatekeepers meant blurring the lines. Documentation softened specifics. No one wrote submarine propellers on a form. Line items described computerized milling machines and control units for industrial applications. Parts moved separately, approvals were staggered, and end-use descriptions talked about electric power utilities and civilian marine work. It looked like modernization, not militarization. And the truth stayed buried in the metadata. Axis counts, control loop performance, interpolation granularity, details that mattered deeply to fluid dynamics but barely registered as a red flag in an office. Inside the Soviet yards, the wall started to crack the first time a machinist watched a finishing pass that didn't chatter. The cutter glided across a hub blade fillet that used to bounce, leaving a sheen that felt wrong to the hand because it was finally right. The inspector checked the map of deviations and saw numbers that were boringly small. No heroic hand polish needed to save a bad cut. No last-minute blend to hide a step. For the first time, you could cut 6 blades that were 6 blades, not 5 close matches and 1 odd cousin. The designers could hear that surface before it ever hit water. Delay cavitation, kill the easy tonals, drop the broadband hiss. The math they'd trusted for years finally had a machine that wouldn't betray it. And somewhere downrange, a US watchstander waited for a roar that never came. Kongsberg Software, Toshiba's iron. While that request slipped through export paperwork, two engineering cultures were about to meet. One built giant, unmoving iron. The other wrote code that made motion feel like thought. Toshiba Machines, MBP 110, was the kind of hardware you only appreciate when you stand under it. 2 stories tall, hundreds of thousands of kilograms of cast rigidity. A spindle that didn't flinch when a multi-ton bronze blank fought back. Across the continent, Kongsberg Wapenfabrik had spent years teaching steel and silicon to obey split-second commands. Missile guidance, numerical control, timing that didn't drift. What nobody outside that world appreciates is how much quiet lives inside math. Simultaneous multi-axis interpolation isn't a brochure phrase. It's the difference between a cutter gliding and a cutter stumbling. Think of a blade surface as a moving target in 5, 6, 9 coordinated directions. Tilt, rotate, sweep, rise, feed, all at once. If one axis lags even a fraction, the tool digs a microstep at a curvature change. That step becomes a pressure edge. That pressure edge becomes a tonal line. Kongsberg's code solved those lags, predicting where the tool had to be and driving every servo like a string section, staying with a conductor's baton. Pair that with the MBP 110 stiffness, and you get geometry that holds. Soviet prop blanks were enormous, and under a lesser machine, the whole setup breathes when the cutter bites. Microns of flex at the hub, a whisper of tilt at full span. On a spectrogram, that flex becomes music. Toshiba's frame crushed that movement into silence. The spindle bearings refused to chatter. The slideways didn't squirm when the head changed direction. You could command a path, and this is the key. The tool would actually follow it in real time, through compound curves, without the tiny stalls that leave acoustic fingerprints. Paper trail hid the essence. On end-use forms, the Toshiba MBP 110 was a computerized milling machine for marine components. The control units read like any industrial CNC. Nowhere did a box say Submarine Stealth. The real tells lived in metadata, axis counts, interpolation granularity, look-ahead depth in the motion planner, servo loop bandwidth. Kongsberg's controller didn't just step from one coordinate to the next. It looked ahead, blended moves, and compensated for machine dynamics so the cutter pressure stayed even. Even pressure equals even surface equals even pressure in water. That's quiet. Inside the Soviet yard, the change sounded like absence. A finishing pass across the hub blade fillet used to sing tiny, regular squeals from a controller approximating a curve with little flats. With Kongsberg's algorithms, the squeal fell away. The operator watched spindle load stay flat where it used to pulse. The deviation map, measuring how far the real surface strayed from the math, shrunk into the noise of the probe. 6 blades cut from one program came out as siblings, not cousins. When they were mounted, their phase matched within hairs. Phase match kills chorus effects. The prop hums less because every blade shares the same truth. Here's where the ocean met software, and where Kongsberg's simultaneous multi-axis interpolation became acoustic strategy. In water, pressure changes love regularity. If your controller leaves systematic dwell marks at specific curvature transitions, those become repeatable, countable signals. If your interpolation smooths those transitions into continuous motion, you smear those signals into nothing a passive array can lock onto. Kongsberg's simultaneous multi-axis interpolation didn't just make machining prettier, it erased periodicity. Toshiba's iron kept that erasure honest by not flexing under load. Together, they produced blades that delayed cavitation by knots and scrubbed the telltale tonals that had anchored Western tracking. The procurement side understood deniability. Contract language bent towards civilian needs. Shipments came in pieces. Drive units here, controller racks there, software updates tucked inside innocuous maintenance kits. When questions came, answers leaned into ambiguity. A 9-axis capable platform can also make turbines, pumps, big impellers for power utilities. That part was true. Dual use was the cover. The intent sat in the way, the controller shipped with interpolation options tuned for large, skewed surfaces, and in the training materials that focused on blade chord transitions and tip radar. Engineers in Leningrad passed around new G-code that looked like poetry compared to the old stuff. Long, smooth command strings without the staccato of point-to-point hacks. The controller's look-ahead function, reading thousands of moves in advance, kept speeds and feeds coherent through the nastiest geometry. You didn't have to slow down at the worst blend to avoid gouging. The machine handled it. That matters for heat and microstructure as well as shape. A cooler, steadier cut leaves a surface that doesn't need aggressive post-polish, preserving the exact curvature the designer wanted. Meanwhile, the US side still read CNC mill and thought in categories, not consequences. A 5-axis label sounded blocked by COCOM. A clever description and split shipments slid the MBP 110 past suspicion. And software. In the 198s, code wasn't policed like steel. A controller with advanced interpolation didn't raise eyebrows unless someone in the room understood what simultaneous meant to a pressure field 50 feet below a hull. At sea, months later, the absence had a rhythm of its own. Fewer tonals, thinner harmonics, a broadband floor that felt lower. The Akula's new props weren't magic. They were the math finally enforced by a machine that didn't argue and a controller that didn't blink. The combination shortened the US advantage from minutes to seconds, from ranges measured in oceans to ranges that demanded better water, better placement, better luck. And luck is not a strategy. Budgets would later count the bill in the tens of billions, with some tallies cresting toward $100 billion across programs. The export gatekeepers and how they blinked. While the spindles were being bolted down in Leningrad, the story on our side of the line looked boring: forms, acronyms, and meetings where nobody raised their voice. COCOM was supposed to be the dam. Allied countries agreed. High-end machine tools and control systems that could shift the military balance didn't cross into the Soviet bloc. Lists spelled out restricted categories. End-use checks were the ritual. You wrote where it was going, what it would do, who would own it. On paper, the system was tight. But dual-use brake systems, a machine that can carve a submarine prop, can also make turbines, pumps, heavy impellers for civilian power utilities. Toshiba's MBP 110 sat right on that seam, classified by capability, described by intent. The words on the form were everything. Computerized milling machines, marine components, improving the electric power utility. Put that next to a model number that, to most gatekeepers, was just another alphanumeric code, and you're halfway across the river. Hear how the seams widened. Approvals didn't land on one desk, they scattered. The base MBP 110 machine was one decision. The Kongsberg control rack and software were another. Training packages a third. Spare parts a fourth. A trading house in between wrote the cover letters. A shell buyer fronted the end-use statement. Each shipment looked harmless by itself, and the timing never lined up in a way that screamed submarines. When a reviewer asked for a site visit, the answers came back reasonable. Big yard, mixed work, pressure to modernize. Everyone nodded and moved on. The paperwork spoke a careful dialect. Axis counts softened into phrases like multi-axis capability. Interpolation options were advanced path planning. Servo bandwidth became responsive motion control. If someone in a ministry didn't live inside machining, those terms washed over them. Meanwhile, the real tells hid in configuration sheets that never passed a curious eye. Simultaneous multi-axis interpolation enabled. Look-ahead length set high. Smoothing filters tuned for large, twisted surfaces. The Kongsberg controller shipped with exactly the features a prop shop needed to erase periodicity, but the labels stayed generic. Bureaucracy likes categories. A 5-axis machine with certain specs tripped alarms. A 9-axis capable platform described as configurable for industrial roles didn't fit the template, and the shipping cadence blurred intent. A base MBP 110 frame left Japan. Months later, a controller with nondescript part numbers followed. Then a maintenance kit with what looked like firmware updates and calibration routines. A training team visited to teach complex contouring. The total picture was a submarine prop factory. The snapshots were just modernization. There were warnings, memos from analysts who'd watched Soviet procurement patterns for years. They flagged the combination. Large format MBP-110 class mills plus Kongsberg advanced controllers routed to yards known for naval work. They underlined the language drift in end-use forms, the sudden appetite for simultaneous interpolation. But the process wasn't built to add weak signals across agencies. Each office saw its slice and weighed risk against trade. Japan's MITI heard industry pressure. Norway's oversight heard a familiar customer in a grey zone. In Washington, COCOM files stacked up, and the habit was to trust allies' internal policing. Facilitators did their job. Trading houses polished the story. Shell buyers laundered destinations through intermediaries that sounded less military. Documentation avoided model numbers when possible, leaning on descriptions that sounded benign. Someone signed a letter saying the machines would support marine components and civil energy infrastructure. Nobody wrote Akula. Nobody wrote skewed propellers. The metadata, the only place where intent breathed, stayed inside controller menus and calibration files. Timeline mattered, too. The early 198s were a messy period for export control culture. Personal computers were exploding, numerical control was spreading, and the idea that software itself could be the weapon hadn't sunk in. COCOM lists were better at blocking obvious steal than subtle code. Inspectors could count axes on a spec sheet. They were less ready to ask how those axes were driven under load through compound curves. Software update didn't light up the board like new missile. The system lagged the frontier. Auditors signed off. They checked serials against lists, confirmed invoices matched shipments, logged site addresses that had plausible reasons to own heavy mills. A few asked about end-use again, got the same answers, and accepted them. The incentive structure leaned toward approval unless a denial was clean and defensible. Risk was diffuse. Responsibility was shared. No one person saw a prop shop being born out of parts. Meanwhile, the crates left the docks. In Leningrad and other yards, riggers craned MBP-110 frames into place and leveled them to within hairs. Kongsberg racks slid into cabinets, fans humming as controllers woke up. Field engineers ran calibration routines, teaching the machines their own flex so the code could cancel it out. The first training cycles cut test pieces with sweeps and fillets no domestic mill could hold. A machinist leaned in, listened for chatter, and heard quiet. Back in the offices, the file folders closed. Stamps went down. Compliance boxes were ticked. Everyone had done their part by the book. What nobody knew at the time was that the book had missed the point. The ocean doesn't care whether a controller's interpolation lives under civilian on a form. It cares about pressure changing smoothly over a blade. And across the world, the spindles began to sing a song that Sonar wouldn't hear. The day the library went quiet. It started as a feeling. A watch team in the North Atlantic rode a thermal, quiet as they could make themselves, and waited for the usual forest of lines to rise on the waterfall. The queue was solid, an outbound patrol that last year would have painted the screen with blade rate, overtones, and a steady shaft wobble. What came up instead was thin, a few hesitant tonals, a floor that felt lower than it should. The log recorded it like weather, anomalous faint signature, and the boat slid on. Across an ocean, a Todere crew dragged coils through water where the library said a Victor series should roar. The operator leaned into the headphones, narrowed the filter, and watched a faint line wobble where a strong beat should hammer. He called the supervisor, they tuned beamformers, they waited for the harmonics to stack. They didn't. The paper afterward read like a shrug. Probable contact, low confidence, environment likely factor. You don't throw out 3 decades of patterns because one night feels off. Then it happened again. A P3 crew over the GIUK gap laid a string of buoys across a lane they'd used for years. The sonar boys whispered back almost nothing. The crew chief thought a buoy failed, then 2. They reseeded the field, the same near silence. The debrief spiraled through oceanography, temperature layers, surface conditions, shipping clutter. Somebody cracked a joke about gremlins. Back home, analysts pulled the tapes and looked for buried lines. The noise floor was real. It sat below where the book said it should. Meanwhile, a Lowe's Angels-class boat, weeks later, picked up a contact that felt like a shadow, a soft, regular pulse hinting at blade count, then slipping under flow noise. The skipper ordered a slow speed change to shift self-noise out of the way. The line firmed for seconds, then dissolved. In the control room, nobody said it out loud, but the thought surfaced. If this is a new normal, we're flying blind. In the message sent after, the words were careful. Signature mismatch. Low tonal presentation, inconsistent with catalogued class. Back at the centers, analysts lined up cases on long tables. SOSUS hits that should have queued planes didn't. Trails that used to last hours vanished in minutes. Engineers checked the arrays. The gear worked. They pulled environmental data. Nothing explained a pattern that stretched across basins. A quiet memo compared yard output dates with detections and found an overlap that nobody liked. Boats from yards recently modernized were hardest to hear. The Akula name crept into sentences with qualifiers, emerging class provisional signature, and then the qualifiers fell away. A micro-story traveled through the community. A SOSUS watchstander on a midnight shift logged a non-event that should have been a raw, exact transit time, route all per past behavior. He went home annoyed, certain he'd missed something. Weeks later, when other stations reported the same thing at the same routes, he pulled his sheet and stared at the blank where a bell should have rung. Training had taught him to trust patterns. Now the pattern was the blank. Inside the labs, narrowband displays looked naked. The old props had painted with heavy brushes, strong blade rate, overtones stacked like rungs, a shaft-related tone beating steady. What scrolled across now was a cleaner spectrum, tonals faint, harmonics thin, broadband shaved down. Analysts hunted for machinery modulation, tiny ripples from pumps and generators, and found hints, not hooks. A few caught a breath of a transient when a target crossed a layer, a faint sigh that gave them a course and speed for a minute. Then it was gone. The arguments got sharp. One camp clung to oceanography, layered water, shipping masking, seasonal effects. Another camp pointed at metal. "You don't lose harmonics like that unless the blade is different," one said in a room that didn't like certainties. They dug into residuals, measuring the spacing between what little remained of the lines. The math said the blade count hadn't changed. The purity had. Pressure pulses were smoother. Cavitation onset had moved right, more speed before the bubbles sang. Then came the pattern that broke the debate. Multiple areas, Atlantic lanes, Pacific approaches, reported near-identical quiet against units that intelligence said were fresh out of specific yards. The dates lined up too clean to ignore. A senior analyst wrote it in one sentence. "We are seeing a step change in acoustic presentation consistent with improved propeller geometry and surface finish." Someone added a note in the margin. "Large multiple reduction claims are aggressive but consistent with delayed cavitation and suppressed tonals." From the boats, the human cost peeked through careful prose. Contact lost without clear cause. Reacquisition unsuccessful despite optimal positioning. Recommend increased aviation support. Commanders widened search boxes. ASW aircraft burned more flight hours trying to fill in gaps that Sonar used to cover. Watchstanders who'd prided themselves on calling class from a heartbeat had to sit with unknown, probable SSN. The confidence that used to ride in the room, born of a library built over 30 years, thinned. In the aftermath of those first months, the briefings changed tone. Screens showed before and after spectrograms, old Soviet songs dense with lines, new passes washed clean. A red overlay marked where the library expected peaks, and a blue overlay marked where reality put them, lower, fainter, sometimes absent. The word parity edged into slides about passive advantage. Nobody liked it. Everybody felt it. And in a quiet corner, a team underlined a sentence they'd been building toward. If props got this clean, the answer isn't louder ears, it's different listening. The day the library went quiet wasn't one day. It was a season of absences, threaded together by crews who knew exactly what should have been there. The revelation wasn't that the ocean had changed. It was that the metal had, with help from machines and code that never should have cut those blades. Inside the prop shop, tolerances, skew, and cavitation. To get why the ocean stopped singing, walk into the prop shop where silence was cut into metal. A bronze blank the size of a small house sits under a gantry. The Toshiba MBP-110 wakes with a low hum. Its head tilts, rotates, advances. 9-axis capable choreography mapped by Kongsberg's simultaneous multi-axis interpolation. The cutter doesn't jab and pause, it glides. Every motion is blended, every transition smoothed before it happens. That's not poetry. That's pressure controlled by geometry, enforced in steel. Start at the blade root, where it meets the hub. Old tools stumbled there. You'd see faint steps, tiny flats where a curve should have been. Those steps shed vortices at steady intervals, and Sonar loved them. With the new controller's look ahead and high bandwidth servos, the path stays continuous. No dwell marks, no micro edges. The fillet becomes a true blend, so the pressure change across it doesn't wink on and off. One repeating tonal just died before the blade even left the machine. Now ride the cutter out along the chord. Skew is the trick that bends pressure waves out of sync so they don't stack into a shout. But skew only works if the surface follows the math everywhere, not just most places. The MBP-110's rigidity matters here. Under load, lesser frames breathe, a whisper of flex that fattens or thins the cut by microns at full span. On a printout, that's nothing. In water, that's a line on someone's screen. With the MBP-110 bolted down, the spindle stays put when the tool bites. The control brain predicts the machine's tiny deflections and cancels them as it moves. You order a curvature, the metal obeys. Then the surface itself. Finish isn't shine for photos, it's the last word in flow. A rough pass leaves miniature ridges that act like speed bumps for water, feeding broadband hiss. The Kongsberg-controlled finish pass, steady load, no chatter, lays down a micro-texture that's uniform, not mirror slick, not orange peel. Uniform. Uniform texture means uniform boundary layer, which means fewer random eddies whispering in microphones miles away. You don't polish your way to that. You cut it into existence. Tolerances stopped being averages and became everywhere. In the old shop, you could be within spec in most places and still sing. One blade tip could end up a hair heavier, another a hair thin. Mount them around the hub and phase mismatch turns the prop into a chorus. With the new code, 6 blades come off the table with deviations buried in probe noise. They're not similar, they're matched. Mount them, index them, and the phase lines up so clean you kill chorus effects before the shaft ever spins. Cavitation is the hard ceiling for silence, the speed where microbubbles burst into applause. You don't avoid it forever, but you can shove that onset right. 2 things push it. Pressure distribution you can trust across the whole radius, and a tip that doesn't knife the water. The simultaneous interpolation earns its keep at the tip, where curvature flips quick and bad controllers hesitate. That hesitation used to leave a faint ledge, a seed for early cavitation. Now the tip geometry holds, the edge stays honest, and the first bubbles form knots later. That's speed the target keeps without waking the ocean. In the bay, a machinist leans in during a finishing pass. He used to brace for the squeal when the head crossed the hub blade blend. Today it stays quiet. Spindle load doesn't pulse. The gauge map afterward looks boring, colors tight, no sudden spikes at the usual trouble spots. He runs his glove along the fillet anyway, a habit older than the code, and feels nothing but a continuous curve. He doesn't need to fix it with a hand stone. The program held. The inspector checks the deviations against the design. Sub-millimeter everywhere, often sub-tenth. He circles the tip radii, the chord thickness at stations that used to be lies told to paper. The numbers repeat across blades like a stamp. When they hang all 6 on the hub, the run-out dial barely twitches. Phase match, thickness match, radius match. The shop doesn't celebrate. It calibrates the next job, downloads a controller patch, and tightens something nobody will see. Meanwhile, the designers back at the bureau finally hear their math in steel. They'd always known what would happen if the pressure pulses smoothed and cavitation slipped. Tonals thin, harmonics lose energy, broadband drops, the blade rate line, the heartbeat sonar text counted, fades under flow noise. In the water, the wake carries less hint of a regular beat. A US array listening 100 miles away gets a softer picture, enough to tease, not enough to pin. That shift forced the hunters to chase what remained. Hull flow, machinery modulation, odd transients when a boat crosses a layer. But those cues live in seconds, not minutes, and they're stingy. The prop shop didn't invent stealth. It enforced it at scale. The MBP 110's stiffness, Kongsberg's interpolation, matched sets, smoother tips, each a fraction, each a fix, added up to a blade that stopped singing and started breathing. And once that breath got into the ocean, the library went from certain to guessing in a season. The intel unraveling, follow the paper, follow the ships. While operators wrestled with silence at sea, analysts chased noise on land, serials, invoices, and whispers that didn't fit. The first clue wasn't grand. A maintenance log in an Allied channel listed a controller firmware update with interpolation parameters nobody in that region should have needed. It referenced simultaneous multi-axis routines optimized for skewed large-diameter rotors. The part number traced to Kongsberg. The destination, a yard that on public maps built marine components, the same yard later linked to Akula outputs. Meanwhile, shipping records turned up a giant. MBP 110 frames routed through trading houses with bland names, parts split into separate consignments months apart. A crate marked machine bed in 1982, a precision spindle in 1983, controller racks in 1984. Each shipment looked legal in isolation. Together they spelled out a prop factory. The cover letters leaned on the same phrasing: civilian utilities, power generation, marine applications, never submarine. Analysts pinned each waypoint to a wall map and saw the pattern: Baltic shipyard first, then sister yards. Humint shaded the picture. A contact in Leningrad described foreign engineers teaching the machines to anticipate curves. An odd way to talk about a mill until you heard anticipate again from another source in Severodvinsk. Across channels, procurement officers started ordering metrology gear, laser trackers, surface probes, good enough to verify sub-millimeter tolerances on twisted geometry. Those instruments weren't window dressing. They were the only way to prove blades were truly matched. The orders landed within months of the quiet patrols. Tech teams went hunting for prop geometries in imagery. You don't see a blade's finish from a satellite, but you can estimate skew, pitch distribution, and tip planform from launch photos and yard-side shots. The new screws showed tighter, more aggressive skew, with chord thickness that read as uniform along stations where older props had obvious bulges. Engineers ran hydrodynamic models and spat out expected pressure fields. The predicted acoustic output fell right where the tapes were getting thin. Then came the serials. A maintenance note from an Eastern European intermediary listed a Kongsberg controller board number that matched a batch sold to Toshiba's export arm in the early 198s. The invoice line called it industrial motion control. The configuration sheet tucked inside was less shy. Simultaneous multi-axis interpolation enabled. Look-ahead depth expanded. Smoothing filters tuned for large radius compound curves. No one wrote Akula, but the math screamed it. The break, if you can call it that, wasn't a single document. It was a correlation chart. On one axis, performance jumps at sea. Instances where passive trails collapsed faster than expected, tonals thinned, cavitation delayed. On the other, yard timelines. When an MBP 110 frame arrived, when a Kongsberg rack was installed, when metrology rolled in, when training teams rotated through. The peaks lined up. Boats launching 12 to 24 months after a full stack came online were the hardest to hear. The analysts stopped arguing oceanography. Unknown to most of the watch floor, a small cell began reconstructing the toolchain. They pulled Toshiba brochures from the early 1980s, MBP 110 specs that bragged about mass and rigidity. They matched those to controller manuals that, if you knew what to look for, revealed interpolation finesse, jerk-limited motion, dynamic error mapping, multi-axis blending that predicted machine flex. They interviewed Western machinists who'd cut turbine rotors. If you can blend a hub blade fillet in one continuous move at that size, one said, you've erased half your periodic problems. Across town, another team sifted export approvals. They found staggered sign-offs. MBP-110 machine beds approved by one office, Kongsberg controllers by another, training by a third, each citing end-use declarations that echoed the same careful language. One approval referenced an inspection at a civilian bay in a mixed yard. The next month, the controller shipped to a different building on the same complex. The inspectors never saw the final assembly. And then there were the updates. Kongsberg pushed software patches with release notes that read like poetry to the right eyes, improved contouring in high curvature blends, enhanced look-ahead for complex surfaces, better compensation tables for large work envelopes. Those updates preceded, by quarters, reports of even cleaner signatures on the newest patrols. It wasn't just the iron, it was the code learning. Inside the debate rooms, a choice hung in the air. Go public, hammer allies, force a reckoning, and tell the other side exactly how well we understood their new ears. Or stay quiet, adapt, and swallow the politics while we rebuilt our math. Washington didn't wait. In 1987, hearings lit up cameras, and the Sledgehammers came out for a Toshiba radio on the Capitol steps. Tokyo and Oslo felt the heat. Internal probes spun up. Executives spoke of errors in documentation. But in the classified annex, the tone was colder. A slide deck closed with 3 lines. Follow the paper, follow the ships, follow the code. Because the ocean had already judged the forms. And the only way back was to learn how to hear the silence that the MBP-110 and political fire cut into bronze. Sanctions, shame, and denial. Washington didn't ease into it. The hearings opened with words like betrayal and blindness, and staffers stacked props on tables, catalog pages, export forms, diagrams with the sensitive bits blacked out. Cameras panned to a slide that read $17 million, then to another that read up to $100 billion. The numbers did the talking. The rest was theater with teeth. A witness from Naval intelligence laid the ground, passive advantage eroding, patrol confidence shaken, timelines aligning uncomfortably with new yard capabilities. He didn't name software, he said control units. He didn't say MBP-110, he said large format multi-axis mills. The members said the names for him. Toshiba machine, Kongsberg Wapenfabrik, COCOM. A chart showed 1981 approvals, 1982 shipments, 1983 assembly, 1984 controller updates, 1985-1986 patrol anomalies. The slope told its own story. Then came the image nobody forgot. On the Capitol steps in 1987, 9 lawmakers lifted sledgehammers and smashed a Toshiba radio. The crack of plastic and glass echoed across morning shows in Tokyo. It looked cheap to some, righteous to others, but it did what it was meant to do, turn policy into a picture. If we can't sanction the prop, we can at least break the brand, one staffer said off camera. The message reached Japanese living rooms on a loop. Tokyo scrambled. MITI called emergency meetings, reviewed the approvals, and emphasized process, end-use declarations, site checks, forms that appeared sound. The line hardened into errors in documentation, a careful way to avoid intent. Toshiba executives faced press lights and said they regretted confusion, regretted harm to relations, regretted anything that suggested military use. They didn't say submarine. They didn't say Akula. Kongsberg's leadership in Oslo followed the same route: cooperation, internal probes, and an insistence that their control systems served many industries, not just the one everyone was talking about. Back in Washington, the sanctions talk heated. Some argued for a total ban on Toshiba imports, others pushed targeted measures, procurement blacklists, export license suspensions, fines with lots of zeros. The administration balanced outrage with alliance calculus. Japan wasn't the adversary, but an example had to be made. Committees drafted bills with levers that could be pulled quickly. Press releases paired strong words with clipped timelines. Diplomats carried tougher messages in private. You fix this on your end, or we'll do it from here. The hearings peeled back process in slow cuts. Why didn't staggered shipments trigger a consolidated review? Who let controllers be approved separate from heavy frames? Why were software updates treated like spare parts? Bureaucrats explained overlaps and grey areas, dual-use categories, and the speed of industrial change. Members shot back that the ocean didn't care about categories. A Navy witness, pressed for a single sentence, offered one. We paid for silence we should have prevented. Markets hissed. Suppliers with contracts tied to Toshiba paused orders. Legal teams drafted material breach letters. Compliance departments rewrote checklists overnight. Export control consultants found themselves fully booked, explaining simultaneous multi-axis interpolation to executives who never cared how a blade was cut. Insurance firms asked clients about end-use verifications they'd never required before. Everyone who'd once sold CNC started saying, "We don't do that kind of CNC." Publicly, the narrative simplified. Western technology let Soviet subs go dark. The fix was punishment and prevention. Classified rooms carried a harder truth. Even airtight sanctions wouldn't put tonals back on tapes. Operators at sea still needed a way to catch a breath across a thermal or a whisper of machinery modulation. The furious energy in front of cameras didn't change the plan of the day in a control room. There were human moments that slipped through. A Toshiba manager, under questioning, admitted documents did not fully reflect the capabilities of the ship systems. The phrase landed like a confession without the word. A Kongsberg engineer, speaking through counsel, said their software optimizes complex contours in multiple industries, and paused too long before adding, including marine. A COCOM liaison acknowledged that in the early 198s, software didn't get the same scrutiny as steel. No one liked how that sounded in 1987. Allies measured distance. Some European partners nodded along with Washington's fury, then asked for specifics in smaller rooms, which parameters mattered, which models crossed lines, how to code lists that caught math without crushing legitimate trade. The answers were messy. You could block a model number. You couldn't block an idea that already lived in universities and industrial labs. The most pointed exchange came at the end of a long day. A member held up a blown-up photo of a spectrogram, old Soviet signature on one side, new on the other, and asked a Navy analyst, "Can we make this go back?" The analyst looked at the two forests, the dense one and the thin one, and said, "No, we have to learn to read the thinner one." That line became a quiet doctrine note for the 1990s and 2000s upgrades. It wasn't a sound bite anyone wanted, but it was the only honest one. Sanctions landed. Procurement bans, fines, compliance monitors, export license freezes. Tokyo and Oslo tightened their own rules, promised deeper end-use checks, and vowed this wouldn't repeat. In cubicles across ministries, people added new lines to forms and new steps to workflows. The Sledgehammer video kept playing, and out at sea, a watchstander slid his headphones back on because hearings were noise, and the ocean was still quiet. The $100 billion hole, programs, pivots, and panic. Speeches fade, budgets don't. In the months after the hearings, planners opened spreadsheets and started counting what silence costs. The first bill hit the fleet. New towed arrays with longer apertures to pull faint lines out of the mud, low-frequency upgrades to amplify whispers the old receivers ignored, and preamps quiet enough to matter when your quarry just shed tonals. Procurement officers who used to talk in single ships began talking in systems. Every hull that hunted needed better ears, and that multiplied fast. Processing became the next cliff. The algorithms that once surfed strong harmonics had to learn patience. Labs pulled teams into rooms with racks of signal processors and told them to find structure in almost nothing. Adaptive beamforming shifted from buzzword to lifeline. You couldn't assume a clean, steady source anymore. You had to let the array learn the ocean in real time and bend itself around the problem. That meant hardware refreshes, more channels, tighter timing, new data paths, and training cycles to match. Meanwhile, aviation picked up slack. P-3 squadrons burned flight hours laying more complicated buoy patterns, trying to net a target that didn't sing. The Navy dusted off low-frequency active concepts, not because anyone loved pinging, but because passive wasn't giving enough. Trials expanded, new source levels were tested, and old arguments about counter-detection came back with teeth. The price tag crept up with every sortie, every prototype projector. Every hour of analysis poured into tapes that used to sort themselves. Doctrine bent under the strain. Patrol boxes widen. If you can't get long-range cues, you stand farther off, which means more water to cover with the same number of platforms. Contact maintenance windows stretch thin. A commander who once planned to trail a target for days now built playbooks around short, opportunistic fixes. Catch the crossing, hand it to a plane, try to reacquire on the other side of a layer. Coordination loads spiked. Submarines, surface ships, and aircraft rehearsed timing like a dance, because a late handoff meant a lost boat. Inside shipyards, the panic had a different texture. Quieting programs for our own fleet accelerated. If the game had shifted to sparse queues and transients, you didn't want to be the one still humming. Teams pulled maintenance forward, rebalanced rafted machinery mounts, and chased down petty contributors to self-noise that everyone used to tolerate. The Seawolf-class case files got thicker. Money that would have dripped in over years started to pour. Overmatch on quiet became more than a line. It was the only sane bet. Intelligence asked for toys too. Non-acoustic detection, ideas that had lived on whiteboards, got real money. Wake tracking through subtle surface signatures, infrared glints from periscope heads, even gravity gradiometers got another look. The odds for any single bet weren't great, but the portfolio had to spread because the adversary had already diversified against our one dominant sensor. Contractors smiled. Accountants did not. Here's where the ledger slapped the room. That $17 million sale, 4 MBP 110 class frames, controllers, training, sat on one side of a line. On the other, the response ballooned into tens of billions. Low-end estimates spoke of $30 billion for immediate catch-up, arrays, processors, training, flight hours. Others, looking at the whole arc through the 199s and into the 200s, Seawolf development, global SOSUS maintenance, aviation tempo, algorithm R&D, export control overhauls, pegged it near $100 billion. Not in one check, in drips that never stopped because the ocean keeps charging rent. Budget politics turned personal. Program managers fought over line items with identical justifications, restores confidence, closes gap. Hill staffers who'd smashed a radio now asked which vendor delivered faster beamformer boards. Fleet commanders wrote risk letters, what happens if we don't buy this now, and slid them into briefings with maps that felt larger than last year. Someone had to pay for the silence. No one wanted their shop to absorb it. Training rewired with the money. Watchstanders learned to live with low senior targets, to stack faint cues across time instead of nailing a class in one glance. Crews drilled on multi-sensor triangulation. Let a plane catch a breath here, a ship feel awake there, a sub hear a soft machinery modulation somewhere in between, and crunch it on the fly. New software arrived on consoles with interfaces that treated uncertainty as normal, not failure. That's not free. Simulators updated. Instructors retrained. The culture bent. There was triage, too. Some cherished programs slowed so the quiet chase could accelerate. Surface combatant upgrades slipped a quarter here, aviation mods were shaved there, and allies were leaned on to carry more water at choke points where we used to sit alone. Diplomats mapped burden sharing onto acoustic reality. The GRUK gap felt like a group project again. Industry adapted in a hurry. Vendors who'd sold CNC pivoted to selling compliance. Metrology firms peddled audits that proved you weren't quietly enabling the next leak. Meanwhile, the signal processing houses sprouted new divisions with words like machine learning and sparse inference on their brochures. In labs, a young engineer pointed at a spectrogram with almost nothing on it and said, "We can teach a model to find that." Here's the uncomfortable truth that settled in. There wasn't a switch to flip. No single program put the lines back. The counter was cumulative. More ears, smarter math, tighter doctrine, quieter hulls, stacked just like the prop fixes that took the lines away. The bill matched the method, fraction by fraction, cost by cost. When planners closed the books each year, the line labeled silence never went to zero. It just moved into the part of the budget you can't cut without waking up deaf. The counter, how the US relearned to hear. The fix didn't start with louder ears. It started with a different question. If the blade's song is gone, what else does a submarine leave behind? In labs that used to hunt for bright tonals, engineers pivoted to the leftovers. Flow noise sliding off a hull, faint machinery modulations, bleeding through mounts, transients when a boat crossed a thermal or changed depth. None of it was generous. All of it was there if you knew where to look and how to wait. Adaptive beamforming went from niche to doctrine. Old processors steered fixed beams and hoped the source cooperated. The new math let the array reshape itself in real time, nudging sensitivity toward the whisper and away from the clutter. Instead of anchoring on a steady blade rate, algorithms tracked statistics, tiny correlations across sensors that hinted a coherent thing moved under the noise. You couldn't stare at one frequency anymore. You had to stitch time and space. The human part changed with the math. Watchstanders learned to ride uncertainty, stacking microcues instead of declaring class from a heartbeat. A faint modulation line would pop for seconds, maybe a pump changing load, then vanish. A flow signature would thicken across a turn and thin when the target settled. Operators marked each flicker, and the processor fused them. Confidence wasn't a spike. It was a slope that climbed as the ocean surrendered crumbs. Fieldcraft adapted. Submarines adjusted speed profiles to push their own self-noise away from the band where the target's remnants lived. Surface ships flew towed arrays deeper or shallower to sit on the right side of thermal bends. P3 and later P8 crews laid staggered buoy patterns to triangulate a transient, not trap a chorus. Handovers became choreography. A boat heard the first hint, vectored an aircraft to catch a breath on a layer, then slid a surface ship across the wake to feel turbulence that shouldn't be there if the lane was empty. The wake became a character. You can bury a song. You can't hide physics. A moving hull drags a fingerprint through water, temperature microsteps, disrupted microbubbles, subtle shear. With better environmental models and a flood of new ocean data, analysts learned to subtract, normal, and watch what failed to blend back in. It wasn't the dramatic surface trail of a destroyer. It was a barely wrong patch of sea that moved like intent. Processing hardware had to grow up fast. The sparse world demanded clean timing across channels and enough horsepower to test 1,000 hypotheses before a queue went stale. Racks in vans and on ships got new boards. The software shifted from fixed pipelines to adaptive graphs. If the model saw a transient in one beam, other branches spun up to test for machinery modulation or layer crossing at the same moment. The array stopped being a camera and became a conversation. There were stumbles. Early models chased phantoms when shipping lanes got messy or a storm broke layers into shards. Crews learned not to fall in love with a single queue. The culture wrote a new rule on the whiteboard, 2 different kinds of truth or it isn't truth. A modulation and a wake, a layer breath and a bearing drift, a transient and a matched movement across buoys. That standard slowed the rush and raised the hit rate. A micro-story from an Akula hunt told the pivot. A Lowe's Angels-class boat rode quiet under complex layer, ears tuned away from the old anchors. The team saw a shallow, wandering line, a machinery flicker too faint to call. They held speed, nudged depth to push self-noise aside, and radioed a P3 to lay buoys along an expected crossing. Minutes later, one buoy coughed a single, clean transient, a breath as the target slipped a layer. The sub tightened bearing. A surface ship, waiting wide, dragged its array across the suspected wake and felt a patch of water that disagreed with the forecast. 3 thin truths, 1 coherent path. First solid fix in months against that yard's newest hull. Back home, the algorithms learned from those nights. Engineers fed models with labeled scraps. This is a layer breath. This is pump modulation under heavy mounts. This is the wake shear you get at 7 knots in this water. Patterns emerged that no single human could juggle. Not magic, just patience baked into code. Training rewired. Simulators put crews in oceans that lied more often than they told the truth. Instructors pressed pause on easy calls and made teams justify every uptick in confidence. Why not flow noise? Why not distant shipping? What second queue are you chasing? The pride that once sat in nailing a class from tonals shifted to building a case the ocean couldn't argue with. Doctrine caught up. Patrol plans assumed short windows and built in pre-placed sensors to widen the net before a fix even started. The payoff wasn't victory laps. It was a steady return of contact times that had collapsed, a rise in reacquisition rates that used to embarrass briefings, and a tone in control rooms that sounded like competence again. The silence stayed. But silence isn't invisibility when you change the math and widen the hunt. The ocean hadn't gotten kinder. We stopped asking it for songs and started asking for movements. And movements are hard to fake. Long tail, China watches, export controls rewrite. While we relearned to hear, others took notes. In the 1990s, Chinese naval planners watched the Akula story unfold and drew a straight line from quiet to survivable. They didn't need blueprints for a propeller. They needed a playbook, precision prop shops, rigid multi-axis mills, and control software with simultaneous interpolation that erased periodicity before a blade met water. The lesson traveled faster than any submarine. Procurement briefs in Beijing started to echo the same innocuous phrases. Industrial modernization, marine components, large diameter rotors. The real asks hid in specs. Axis counts that implied true simultaneous motion, controller look-ahead depths that gave away complex contouring, servo bandwidths tuned for mass and inertia of huge workpieces. If you knew the Toshiba MBP 110 story, you heard the rhyme. If you didn't, it sounded like factory upgrades. Western export regimes tried to close the gaps. COCOM's old lists, built in the 1980s to police steel and shafts, were rewritten into tighter frameworks through the 1990s and 2000s. End-use checks got teeth. Licenses demanded audits that didn't stop at a model number. They dragged inspectors into shop floors to see what the controller menus actually enabled. 9-axis capable stopped being a shrug. Simultaneous multi-axis interpolation became a flagged phrase. Software patches, once waved through as maintenance, came under the same scrutiny as the iron they animated. Industry felt the shift. Compliance officers who'd skimmed spec sheets for years now sat with engineers and asked what look-ahead blending did to a blade fillet. Suppliers mapped their chains down to servo boards and encoder chips, because a single upgrade could turn a bland mill into something that erased periodicity at scale. Contracts added clauses about embedded compliance, tamper-evident seals on control racks, logging that recorded which interpolation modes were used, even early talk of kill switches that could disable sensitive functions if end use drifted from what the paper said. China adapted around the walls. Domestic firms pushed to absorb the math, hiring engineers who knew motion planning and multi-axis blending from the inside. Joint ventures sat one step away from restricted tech, but close enough to learn the edge cases that matter. How to keep tool pressure even across a steep, twisted surface. How to predict and cancel a machine's flex before it imprinted on metal. In universities, theses on cavitation onset, skew, and tip radii read like the front end of a quieting program. You didn't have to smuggle a controller if you could write one as good at home. Meanwhile, export control culture matured from lists to patterns. Intelligence shops stopped chasing only boxes and started chasing behaviors. Orders for metrology that made sense only if you were matching blades. Calibration files that referenced chord stations and tip radii. Training materials that dwelled on hub blade blends. A company requesting advanced contouring, plus a laser tracker, plus a surface profilometer didn't prove submarine intent, but it narrowed the universe. Red flags started to live in combinations, not categories. Allies learned to move in sync. The 199s and 200s saw multilateral task forces that swapped serial ranges, firmware hash lists, and travel logs for field engineers. A controller flagged in one port couldn't reappear under a new invoice 2 months later without someone noticing. That coordination wasn't perfect, but it was better than the siloed approvals that let the MBP 110 frames and Kongsberg brains slip apart and reunite behind a different gate. Industry culture changed under pressure. Vendors stopped saying, CNC is neutral, and started asking what a customer would cut, who audited them, and whether their compliance staff could read a post-processor file. Some embedded hardware limits, caps on contouring frequency or axis synchronization, unless a buyer cleared deeper reviews. Others built modes that logged when simultaneous multi-axis interpolation ran, creating trails that could be checked in surprise inspections. None of it made intent obvious. It made denial harder. Still, the strategic echo spread. As quieting tech diffused, sometimes legally, sometimes through grey channels, the cost to hear kept rising. The hunt became a math problem that never ended. More sensors, smarter fusion, better ocean models, constant software refreshes. You could slow the spread of iron. You couldn't quarantine an idea once it paid off at sea. There was a second, sharper lesson buried in the metadata. In the 198s, a few lines in a controller menu changed the ocean. In the 200s, that kind of shift no longer needed a crate. A software patch could retune interpolation. A calibration file could tighten a shop's tolerances overnight. A firmware update could enable a look-ahead depth that smoothed exactly the blend that used to sing. Export regimes wrote new pages for code, but code moves like water. It seeps through partnerships, academia, and the open literature of engineering. China didn't have to copy an Akula screw to learn from it. They had to internalize the chain, math to motion to metal to ocean. That chain is modular. Swap in domestic mills as they mature. Write your own Kongsberg. Train inspectors who measure what Sonar cares about, not what a caliper can reach. The Playbook was in plain sight the day the library went quiet. Bring it back to the sailors in the dark. They don't track licenses, they track absences. Every time a new hull crosses a layer without leaving the old song, they feel the long tail in their bones. Export controls matter. So does the next algorithm, the next fusion trick, the next way to read a wake. Because tomorrow's leak won't look like a crate. It'll look like a software update that shipped on a Friday and
Human
changed
cost,
the ocean by
watchstanders,
skippers, and sleepless patrols. The first thing it stole was confidence. A junior watchstander who used to call class from 3 lines in 30 seconds now sat with a pencil tapping the console, logging fragments that never grew into a name. He wasn't timid, he was honest. Probable SSN, he'd say, then cross it out and write unclassed contact, low confidence, while the room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. Skippers began sleeping in their chairs. They'd learned across their careers that patience plus library equals control. The new math said patience plus silence equals drift. One captain wrote a line in his night orders, "Wake me for uncertainty," and meant it. He'd step into control at 30, eyes at the plot, and ask for the second truth they didn't have yet. The XO would point to a faint modulation that popped for 10 seconds and died. The captain would nod like a man, counting seconds between lightning and thunder. Training shifted from posture to doubt. Instructors ran teams through tapes where the right answer never announced itself. Students learned to explain, "We don't know yet," without apologizing, to thread microcues into a case rather than reach for class out of pride. Debriefs felt different. Instead of circling a wrong answer in red, a teacher would circle a jump in confidence without a second cue and ask, "What made you think the ocean agreed with you there?" It wasn't humiliation. It was recalibration. The near collision scared everyone into humility. Early in the Akula era, a Lowe's Angels-class boat sat under a layer southeast of the GIUK Gap, building a picture out of crumbs. A soft line rose, held, then disappeared. The team marked bearing drift, guessed slow speed, and kept their own turns minimal to preserve the fragile soundscape. 10 minutes later, the contact reappeared closer than the plot allowed. The helm answered a hard rudder. Coffee hit the deck. The plotter drew a proximity circle too small for comfort. Nothing touched. In the debrief, the skipper didn't curse the team. He cursed the assumption they'd inherited, that a target that quiet would respect the old geometry of trail and counter-trail. It didn't. It walked up the layer and breathed on their necks before they heard it. Watchstanders started writing margins into their own notebooks. 2 kinds of truth or it isn't truth. A breath across a thermal plus a machinery flicker. A wake shear plus a bearing drift. They built timing discipline that felt like superstition. Hold speed through the hint. Don't blink the array with an unnecessary depth change. Don't chase a phantom with your own self-noise. It read like ritual. It was physics disguised as calm. Sleep became a negotiation. Crews ran hot racks and hotter heads. The people who'd grown up on strong signals now drove themselves to hear smaller worlds. You'd see a senior operator stand behind a junior and force his own hands to stay off the board. "Call what you see, not what I want," he'd say, and then 30 silent seconds would stretch long enough to make knuckles white. When the kid called a weak transient and asked for a boy field, the senior nodded once and left the room, because the right thing had been said out loud. Commanders took on a new kind of risk math. Trails got shorter, handoffs got sharper, and the penalty for overconfidence got more immediate. A safe bet became a bad bet if you treated silence like compliance. That showed up in message traffic. Phrases like recommend widened search pattern and request additional aviation support multiplied. The tone was careful, never panicked, but a reader could feel the gap. More assets to hold less certainty. More time to earn the second truth. More humility, dressed up as scheduling. The machines weren't the only things learning. Pride took a hit and came back as craft. Sailors swapped techniques across squadrons the way chefs trade tricks. Hold this speed above that layer with this array depth. You'll catch the breath at the crossing. Ignore the first modulation uptick after a rudder order. It's your own mount waking up. These weren't in manuals. They traveled as human threads, braided into a culture that accepted ambiguity as the water it swam in. There were quiet victories. A young team strung microcues together across 6 hours, 2 breaths, a faint pump shift, a wake patch that didn't belong, and handed a solid fix to a P3 crew that almost didn't believe the brevity of the call. Back on the pier, nobody high-fived. They cleaned coffee off the acoustic rack and slept 10 hours in a place that still vibrated with machines, because the next patrol would ask for the same patience at a worse hour. Leadership bled into the details. Captains started saying, "I don't know yet," into the radio on purpose, so their crews would hear it without shame. Chiefs drilled their sections on calling an abort for noise discipline like it was an act of strength, not fear. Wardrooms started reading export control briefings over midrats, not because paperwork would help them find a boat, but because the chain from form to water had touched their lives, and understanding its fragility made the ocean feel less arbitrary. Meaning settled in late. A leak in the 198s turned into 1,000 small stresses in rooms with no windows. It looked like sleep lost, instincts sanded smooth, risks named earlier, pride trimmed into craft. For the people in the dark, quieting tech wasn't a scandal headline. It was the taste of recycled air at 40 and a pencil tapping a console while someone somewhere asked the ocean for one more crumb. What nobody knew then, the metadata lesson. Get this, the secret wasn't the crate, it was the settings. In the 198s, everyone stared at hardware lists and missed the metadata that actually moves a blade through space. Axis counts, interpolation modes, look-ahead depth, servo bandwidth. A stamp on a form said computerized milling machine. A controller menu quietly said simultaneous multi-axis interpolation enabled. The ocean listened to the menu. Bureaucracy spoke in categories. Battlespace spoke in tolerances. If your library depends on a Soviet prop always leaving the same periodic scars, then shaving a few microns at a fillet, or keeping a spindle load flat through a curvature flip doesn't read like paperwork. It reads like a 20-fold noise drop at sea. That's the paradox the watch floor felt before the committees did. The line between civilian and military wasn't a model number. It was a planner that blended motion so evenly the water stopped noticing. Here's the uncomfortable part. None of this was esoteric to the people who cut things for a living. Machinists had been muttering for years that stepped contours sing and smooth ones don't. What nobody connected fast enough was how software maturity turns a shop upgrade into changed physics at range. Add rigid iron that doesn't breathe, controllers that look ahead thousands of blocks, compensation maps that cancel flex, and matched blades that line up in phase. And the ocean's old tells fall apart like a story missing verbs. Meanwhile, our side trusted libraries the way pilots trust checklists. We de-built them, curated them, treated them like ground truth. And they were, until they were. The lesson wasn't libraries are useless. It was libraries rot unless you assume the other guy's metadata evolves. Soviet design bureaus already had the math. They needed enforcement. MBP 110 frames plus Kongsberg code did the enforcing. That pairing didn't invent silence, it industrialized it. So the warning stretches forward. Controls live at the edges of supply chains, post-processors, calibration files, firmware toggles labeled, advanced contouring. They don't trip export alarms unless someone asks why a power utility customer needs high look-ahead on compound curves or smoothing tuned for twisted large-diameter rotors. After the 1987 Sledgehammers, regimes tightened lists through the 199s and 200s, but the center of gravity kept sliding towards software. Today, the next leak won't sail on a freighter. It'll push through as an update, signed and ordinary, that changes how a machine thinks about motion. Strategic humility follows from that. Assume adversaries adapt. Assume forms lag physics. Assume a handful of milled surfaces, backed by code you can email, can make a carrier screen misjudge a lane or a boomer's trail go cold. The flip side is discipline. Instrument what matters, log what controllers actually do, audit the combinations, metrology orders plus interpolation features plus training on hub blade blends. You're not catching a product, you're catching a pattern. In the end, the ocean kept its rules. We mistook our catalog for its law. The metadata lesson says don't fight categories, fight periodicity. And the fight begins where motion planning meets metal. A handful of milled surfaces turned superpower certainty into guesswork, because the ocean keeps its own scorecard and only physics gets a vote. If you want the untold leaks shaping today's fights, firmware toggles, satellite exhaust trails, drone RF fingerprints, subscribe and watch our deep dive on how AI is rewriting targeting right now. Drop a comment with the one tiny detail you think keeps generals awake.